The Measure of Quiet Water. Episode 1, The Listening Stone. Pearled morning light rested over Cloudstep Spring, turning every wet edge pale without making anything shine too sharply. Water slipped from a dark seam in the cliff into the round spring bowl, passed beneath its worn lip, and entered the upper measure. Below, the saffron steps descended between rosemary terraces toward the waking village. Amara Day stood with one hand on the bowl and listened. Cool stone pressed her palm. The water carried several notes: the glassy inlet thread, the hollow voice below the overflow, the narrow run into the measure. She had known them since childhood. This morning the center note was softened, as if someone had placed a folded cloth beneath a cup. Leela Van arrived with 2 willow baskets and a survey cloth. You heard it from the steps. At the 3rd landing, during the last release. They laid out 3 marked gauges, a brass rule, sounding rods, waxed cord, a clay knife, a little brush, and the box of marker stones. Leela had also brought rosemary tea. Steam rose with a resinous scent that mingled with wet limestone. When Amara reached for a sounding rod, Leela touched it lightly. 1 full cycle first. The drift may happen only during release. The drift may happen only during release. Then the release will show us. They sat. Waiting at a waterwork was not the same as doing nothing, though Amara's attention immediately composed a list of useful-seeming acts. Check the pins. Lift the first gate. Rake the seams. Test the float. Every action arrived wearing the face of responsibility. Leela poured tea. Named the sounds. Amara listened. Inlet. Bowl lap. Overflow. Upper run. First cascade. Rosemary feeder. A faint ticking came from the western seam. Air. Rosemary ticky. Came from the western seam. Air. Temporary, Leela said. The tick vanished after 3 breaths. The spring bowl filled until its float nudged the hidden lever. The upper gate opened the width of a thumb. Water entered the measure with a fuller voice, spread around 3 dark listening stones and gathered at the division gate. The first note rang clear. The center remained soft. The 3rd carried a slight trembling aftertone. At the downstream gauge, water climbed to the 1st mark, paused, and reached the 2nd a little later than expected. It did reach it. Nothing spilled. When the gate closed, the level fell cleanly to its resting pin. Amara rose, but Leela reminded her that the cycle continued downstream. They listened from the platform while the release crossed rosemary and sage. The saffron steps gave back the water's descending notes. No gate knocked twice. No overflow slapped a wall. Only after the resting trickle returned did Leela ask what they knew. The bowl and gate are normal. The first listening point is clear. The center is softened. The 3rd carries its tremble. The downstream gauge rises slowly but reaches the customary mark. Both her blinds receive water. And the size of the trouble? Limited. Somewhere in the broad center, it does not ask us to alter a gate. A gate. They inspected the spring bowl before touching the reach. Its level stood 1 finger below the old crescent cut. The bronze grate was clean. A snail traveled beneath the lip without obstructing anything. Amara left it there. At the first notch, she lowered a gauge until its soft wooden cap met the floor. Leela recorded the depth and read back the customary range. The value lay within it. At the 2nd notch, the water was shallow by the width of a barley grain. At the 3rd, it returned to the range's lower edge. They repeated every reading from the opposite wall, and rinsed the gauge between measurements. The pattern persisted, slight, local, consistent. It merited attention, but not alarm. Amara watched bubbles catch in the carved numerals and vanish. If the gate were narrow, the loss would appear at the first notch. If the division held back, the third would be high. So, water is losing speed in the center without losing volume. Water is losing speed in the center without losing volume. Or taking a longer path, Leela said. The fitted channel floor looked clear through the moving surface. No obstruction announced itself. Amara felt the familiar desire to make the invisible visible with her hands. Instead, she completed the survey of the bowl, folded the brass rule, and wrote the first values on the slate. The morning strengthened around them. Pearls of light gathered on rosemary leaves. Beneath the spring's many clean notes, the softened tone remained. It did not ask for haste. It asked to be understood. Amara remained beside the bowl while Leela recopied the first readings in a smaller hand. The record slate had enough room for a morning's work if each entry was concise. But Leela disliked abbreviations that another keeper might misunderstand. She wrote the location, the phase of the release, and whether each value had been observed or inferred. Amara watched her draw a short line beneath the numbers. Why the line? Amara asked. Everything above it belongs to the untouched channel, Neela said. Whatever we do later should not wander backward and improve our memory. Amara nodded. It was easy after finding a cause to believe the first signs had been clearer than they truly were. The note had been softened, not broken. The rise had been delayed, not stopped. Nothing downstream had failed. She repeated those facts aloud, and Leela placed a dot beside each one. They examined the platform itself. Rain sometimes washed grit from the path into the spring work, but the drainage groove behind the wall lay clear. Its last deposit was dry and brown, unlike the fine gray-gold mineral silt visible beneath the channel water. No fresh footprint crossed the wet margin. The lid on the survey store had remained fastened. These details did not locate the obstruction, but they excluded a sudden spill of hillside soil or careless work. Amara walked around the bowl and looked into the dark inlet seam. The spring emerged from stone too narrow for a hand. Its clear thread carried no suspended grit that she could see. She held a white gauge cap beneath it for 5 breaths. When she raised the cap, it bore only bright water. Source is clear, she said. Leela recorded it. Within what we can see. Amara corrected herself. Visible source water is clear. The visible source water is clear. The precision was not fussiness. It kept a small observation from dressing itself as complete knowledge. Amara dried the gauge cap and hung it from her fingers. They next inspected the float without lifting it. Through a narrow slot in the bowl wall, Amara could see the cedar arm rise as water accumulated. Its pin moved freely. The cord showed no fray. A pale mineral line marked the height of recent releases and matched the current travel. She wanted to pull the pin and oil it simply because the tool roll contained oil. Does it ask? Leela said. No. Then let it perform its own task. They moved into shade while the bowl refilled. From there, the upper measure appeared less like an instrument and more like part of the terrace. A line of fitted stone, dark slabs, and clear water half hidden among herbs. Its accuracy had never depended on looking new. The crescent cut on the bowl was older than the oldest keeper Amara had known. One corner of the first listening stone was pale where generations of rods had touched it. Amara remembered being brought there at 8 years old. She had expected the listening stones to sing like festival bells. Instead, they gave modest notes, easily covered by speech. Her first teacher had made the children close their eyes. Not because closed eyes improved hearing by magic, but because half of them were staring at one another and laughing. Amara had heard the water then as separate splashes. Years passed before she could follow one release through its changing depths. That memory made the present soft note feel less like a failure in something familiar, and more like a word in a continuing conversation. Familiarity did not mean the channel must always sound identical. It meant she possessed comparisons. Leela asked her to describe the weather. Amara noted no rain for 4 days, cool nights, a mild eastern breeze, and no unusual draw at the public cistern. The spring's seasonal pressure was ordinary. Rosemary beds were established and did not require an extra release. Each fact narrowed the space in which the softened sound could be meaningful. At the next bowl rise, they watched from different sides. Amara observed the float and gate. Leela watched the first marker. The lever moved with no hesitation. The gate opened to its stop and remained there. The first marker rose on time. If we had touched the gate before this, Leela said afterward, what would we know? Only that it behaved after we touched it. And what do we know now? That its existing setting works. They made a chalk mark on the survey cloth beside the gate tools, indicating they were not required. Amara liked the small decisiveness of it. Setting aside a tool could be as intentional as choosing one. They took their tea to the platform edge. The rosemary infusion had cooled enough to drink easily. Amara tasted green bitterness, a trace of honey, and the mineral scent of the water used to brew it. Leela broke a small oat cake in half and passed one piece over. For several minutes they ate and watched light descend the cliff. A lizard emerged between 2 warm stones, halted when it saw them, and continued toward the wall. A thread of spider silk stretched above the overflow, jeweled with spray. None of these things needed entry on the slate. They belonged to the morning without becoming evidence. Bounded does not mean trivial, Amara said eventually. No. It means we know where not to work. Leela lifted her tea in acknowledgement. That is often the more valuable half. Amara reviewed the boundaries, not the source, not the bowl level, not the release mechanism, not the first listening point, not the downstream gates. The broad center deserved inspection. The rest deserved to remain as it was until the center explained the drift. When they rose, she rolled her shoulders and looked once more at the laid-out tools. The mallet remained in its loop. The clay knife remained clean. The baskets waited empty. For the next round they needed only gauges, slate, line, and perhaps the rosemary beds themselves. Leela gathered her end of the survey cloth so the breeze would not fold it. Ready? Ready to map it, Amara said. They traced the release beyond the upper measure. At the first division, a wedge-shaped stone separated water into the rosemary and sage feeders. Amara gauged the eastern thread while Leela watched the western. Both lay within customary tolerance, though the rosemary line hesitated faintly against its inner wall. The rosemary plants had grown woody near their roots and tender at their tips. Amara moved a branch aside to inspect the feeder. No fallen stem blocked it. When she released the branch, a short forked twig snapped from its dry underside and landed across her wrist. Leela held out her palm. A traveling inspector. It may be too light. It may be too light. Then it will report on the surface. I have they returned uphill without changing the gates. A second release began. Amara knelt beside the first narrow run and held the twig above it. A rosemary twig touched the channel and immediately changed direction. Amara had set it into the terrace water measuring reach to locate a mild obstruction, expecting it to travel straight through the upper measure. Instead, the twig spun once, pointed upstream, and slid sideways toward the wall. She followed on her knees as the current caught it. It passed the first marker cleanly. In the broad center it slowed, One fork dipped. The twig turned in a small circle beside the middle listening stone, escaped, then circled back to the same place. There, Leela said. Amara caught it before it lodged. Beneath the surface, behind the stone's lower edge, a pale ribbon of fine silk lifted and settled with each curl of current. The pocket was no wider than her palm, but it bent the surface flow enough to return their harmless indicator. They had found the obstruction without moving a gate. They sent the twig through twice more. From the inner line it made the full circle. From the center it curved halfway. From the outer wall it passed cleanly. Leela drew the 3 paths on the slate. Localized, Amara said. They still followed the release to the terraces. Water darkened the soil evenly around rosemary roots. Sage leaves bent under occasional bright drops. Every side notch emitted its proper thread, and no fresh stain appeared above a wall. Back at the measure, Amara checked each marker with waxed line and brass rule. The first sat true. The second appeared low, but comparison with prior records showed that its niche had not shifted. The water beside it had fallen slightly because the current curved toward the pocket downstream. No marker change yet, she said. Good. A marker should not chase its reading, Leela answered. They allowed the release to finish, then observed the whole return to rest. The task now had a clear boundary, a palm-wide pocket of silt, perhaps a loosened listening stone, 2 markers to verify after cleaning, and 1 full release to confirm the work. Amara rinsed the rosemary twig and laid it on the survey cloth. Beside the unused tools, it made the abundance of equipment look less like permission and more like choice. They made another round of readings while the resting current ran. At each point, Amara named what the value could prove and what it could not. A depth showed where the surface stood. It did not by itself identify why. A note announced change. It did not demand replacement. A circling twig revealed a local current. It did not measure the full channel. Leela listened with the same attention she gave the water. You are separating notice from remedy. I am trying. That separation is where most careful work begins. Below them, a baker crossed the second saffron landing carrying an empty flower cloth. She waved but did not climb to ask questions. The upper measure was village work, visible and ordinary. Its keepers did not need to dramatize maintenance to prove they had attended to it. Amara recorded the time of the delayed rise, the resting depths, and the twig's 3 paths. She drew a small square around the center listening stone and wrote, "Inspect seat, at next rest." She did not write replace. The distinction pleased her more than she expected. They did not yet close the map. Amara wanted the return interval as well as the rise. So they placed tiny chalk dashes beside the slate's edge and counted breaths from the upper gate's closure. The first notch fell promptly. The broad center held its depth for 4 breaths longer than the old record's usual interval. Then it released without a sudden gulp. Soft storage behind the stone. A soft storage behind the stone, Akali, Leah answered. Write what happened first. Amara wrote. Center depth held 4 breaths beyond recent customary observation. Beneath it she added, consistent with local sheltered pocket. The first sentence could survive even if the second proved wrong. They repeated the timing at the next cycle. This time, the difference was 3 breaths. A breeze crossed the bowl, and the float began from a slightly different lap. The variation reassured Amara. A mechanical catch would more likely have shown a sharper, repeatable pause. Fine silt and surface currents would vary gently. At the rosemary division, she crouched until her eye stood level with the surface. Reflected sky made the water seem opaque from above, but from the side she could see the flow lean toward the inner wall and straighten after the wedge stone. The twig's route had translated that subtle lean into a visible circle. She sketched the curve, marking only the portion they had directly observed. Leela walked 10 paces up and back, listening from different positions. The center note disappears behind the first cascade when I stand at the step. That is why I heard it only during release. And only from one landing. A person elsewhere might hear no change. The problem was real even if it was not obvious from every place. Amara did not need universal notice to justify maintenance. She needed sufficient evidence and a proportionate response. They inspected the edges of the broad center with the brass rule held above water. The upstream wall remained straight. At the listening stone, a gap too narrow for the rule's edge admitted a trembling fringe of silt. Amara did not probe it. The moving pale ribbon already told them that loose material lay behind the slab, and pushing metal into the seam could pack it deeper. Instead, she lowered the soft-capped gauge immediately before and after the stone. Upstream, depth stood a grain high during middle flow. Downstream, it stood a grain low. At rest, both returned to range. The pocket altered the path most when the release was full. Leela added the values to the map. The accumulating evidence formed a simple shape rather than a scatter of suspicions. Amara traced it with one finger above the slate: normal bowl, normal gate, normal first reach. Slowed inner thread, silt at center stone, normal division, normal beds. If the stone proves whole, she said, we clean and reseed it. If it proves cracked, we stop, keep the channel on resting flow, and bring a matched replacement before another full release. If the niche is broken, we stop and ask Thomas to repair the wall seat. If neither, we do not invent a third fault. Leela's smile was almost hidden as she bent over the slate. The sun reached the uppermost rosemary flowers. Their small blue blossoms held bees now, and the air took on a warm herbal thickness above the beds. Amara moved carefully along the narrow surface edge so her shadow would not startle the insects into her path. She checked the first 3 soil basins with 2 fingers. Moist earth crumbled softly and held together when pressed. The beds had indeed received enough water to miss a single scheduled release during repair. She made the observation at the outer margins, not only near the feeder, because dark soil at an inlet could conceal dryness farther away. Leela did the same in sage. They met at the division stone and compared. Both sides were evenly damp. Holding one release would not turn routine maintenance into a downstream problem. A village child stopped on the saffron steps and watched them. He carried a bunch of onions almost as tall as his torso. Is the spring broken? I asked. No, Amara said. The measure has a small pocket of silt. Will the water stop? Only one release while we clean it. The beds already have what they need. The beds already have what they need. The child considered this, apparently disappointed by the absence of catastrophe. Can silt here? Leela replied, not well enough to move when asked. He laughed and continued down, onion tops swaying above his shoulder. Amara watched him go. Her answer had been easy because the task was bounded. She could state what was wrong without enlarging it, and describe the interruption without hiding uncertainty. They returned to the twig's discovery point and observed it without another test. Sending the indicator repeatedly could eventually break leaves into the channel. 3 routes were enough. Leela wrapped the twig loosely in the damp corner of the cloth, preserving it for the confirmation pass. Amara checked the marker niches visually. Each was carved into a separate wall stone so that resetting one could not displace another. The second and third would be lifted only because cleaning beside them might pack silt into their edges. The first would remain, providing an unchanged reference. Would you photograph this with memory if you could? Ushed. Every grain. Ushed. Every grain. And would every grain help you put it back? Amara looked at the hand-laid variations in the wall. No, the survey lines and the marker cuts will. She measured those again and spoke the values while Leela recorded them. Redundancy was useful where it protected calibration, not where it prolonged uncertainty. They tied small loops in the waxed cord corresponding to the fixed survey heights. If chalk washed from the rule, the cord would preserve their reference. The next full cycle passed with the same mild symptoms. Neither the delay nor the note worsened. That stability confirmed they had time to wait for the scheduled rest rather than interrupting the gate midway. While they waited, Leela told Amara how the listening stones had been selected. Years before, keepers had tested dozens of slabs beside the lower cistern, striking them wet and dry, upright and flat. They did not choose the loudest. They chose 3 whose changing notes remained distinct within the narrow water depths of the measure. So the stone's note is relational, Amara said. To depth, seat, current, and the other stones. That is why one tap cannot order a repair. Tack. But a changed note can invite the measurements we made. Exactly. The spring gate closed. They listened to the tail descend. Amara no longer experienced the interval as waiting to begin real work. Mapping had been real work. It had kept their hands within the scale of the problem. At last the lower cascade softened. Leela checked the herb beds once more, then set the slate beside the sounding rods. Now we ask the stone, she said. At rest, Amara took out the sounding rods. Their ash shafts ended in horn caps, gentle enough to let stone speak without forcing it. She wiped the first listening slab and tapped once. A clear, brief tone answered. She tapped the third. Its lower note carried a faint tremble. Then she faced the center slab. The first listening stone had given the clear, rounded tone recorded for the village channel at resting depth. The center stone answered with a dull double sound, one note from the slab and another from something shifting beneath it. Amara knelt beside the upper measure. These were calibrated listening points, not decorations. Their tones helped keepers notice changes in depth and current. Yet a changed note did not by itself mean damaged stone. Fine silt breathed from behind the center slab when she pressed its top. One corner yielded by less than a grain. Amara felt along the exposed upper edge and found no crack. The stone remained in its niche, whole as far as they could inspect without lifting it. What had changed was the support beneath it. Tomas had climbed quietly from the village with 3 portions of prepared clay wrapped in damp leaves. Leela had rung the terrace bell while Amara followed the twig. 2 portions remained untouched. They can go back under cloth, Thomas said. Clay does not mind being unnecessary. Thomas listened to the 2 notes, pressed the yielding corner, and examined the faint line of old clay visible beneath it. The seat is thin here. Hash, he said. If the underside proves sound when we lift it, this stone needs seating, not replacement. The diagnosis bounded their plan, but fine silt still lay across the niche and center floor. Amara proposed the complete work: hold one scheduled release, remove the loose silt, inspect the underside, renew the full thin seat, reset the second and third marker stones, then observe a complete release through the herb beds. No change to the gate stop or float, she added. Tomas glanced downhill. The beds can miss one release. Their soil is dark to the margins. Leela wrote 4 lines on the slate. Nothing else. While the bowl approached rest, they prepared. Tomas tested the clay between finger and thumb. Leela soaked the baskets so their ribs would not take up muddy weight. Amara tied waxed cord around the listening stone to steady it, not pull it free. She nearly bound the third stone too. Its aftertone might indicate a separate looseness. She pressed its top. It did not move. She tapped it again, and its tremble had already diminished since the center corner was seated. Amara left it alone. Leela latched the scheduled release. Water continued through the resting overflow, keeping the channel wet while the full gate remained closed. They waited until the prior release's last note faded from the lowest terrace. Amara lifted the second and third marker stones and placed each on a separate square of the survey cloth. Their niches held only fine dust. With the water thinned to a transparent sheet, the obstruction showed itself. A gray-gold fan sheltered behind the center slab. "A patient hill," Thomas said. "Patient hill alter measurements." "Certainly. They seldom require shouting." "Certainly. They seldom require shouting." Amara felt along the stone's base. The clay remained firm except at the upstream corner, where her fingertip found a shallow hollow. No crack crossed the stone. No broken mortar lay beneath it. The discovery made the work smaller. She felt that truth physically, as her shoulders lowered and her breathing matched the spring. They agreed on positions. Thomas would steady the slab. Amara would clear and reseat it. Leela would carry silt to the settling patch, where it could dry and later enter terrace mortar, rather than wash through the herb beds. Before starting, Amara repeated the plan. Leela repeated the closure test. Thomas named the signs that would stop them: a hidden crack, a damaged niche, a moving wall stone. None was present. The work could be completed with what lay on the survey cloth. It required no new stone, no altered gate, and no return visit after stability was proven. Before the scheduled rest arrived, Thomas asked to see the earlier readings. He held the slate at arm's length, his lips moving slightly as he followed the values from the bowl to the lower junction. "You did not bring me because the note changed," he said. "We brought you because the note, depths, and surface path pointed to the stone's seat," Amara replied. "Good. A stoneworker summoned for every unfamiliar sound soon becomes a professional source of new stones." He set down the slate and examined the spare clay portions. One contained fine grit for wall repair. Another was softer, intended for shallow bedding. He chose the soft mixture and returned the gritty one to its leaf wrapping. "Not use the stronger clay?" Amara asked. "Strength for what force? The slab bears almost no load. It needs a continuous seat that can be renewed without chiseling the niche. Hard mortar would make the next small maintenance into large work." Hafen added that reasoning to her understanding, though not to the formal plan. The upper measure had endured because its materials allowed care at the proper scale. A repair could be durable without trying to become permanent. They tested the listening stone once from the downstream face. Its double note remained. Thomas pressed the upper corner and the second note shortened. When he released it, the dull aftersound returned. "Loose seat, not loose wall," he said. "If the wall moved, your neighboring joint would answer too." Amara tapped the wall stone beside it. The sound was compact and high. No grain emerged from its seam. Leela pointed toward the third listening slab. "And its tremble?" Soisthan Tamoth listened to both in sequence. "Sympathy through water. The center's second pulse reaches the third face. We will know after reseating. I would not disturb the third now." This agreed with Amara's decision, but she valued the independent reason. She recorded the third stone as firm, with aftertone likely transmitted. Likely remained important. They would confirm later rather than convert agreement into certainty. The spring bowl approached its release height. Because they intended to hold the next cycle, Leela walked down to the herb beds once more and called to 2 terrace workers that the upper water would pause. Neither expressed concern. One raised a muddy hand from the sage rose. The other pointed to the dark outer margin of the rosemary soil. When Leela returned, she reported, "No downstream objection." "No downstream need," Amara said. "That is the better record." The 3 of them reviewed how they would protect the spring. No removed silt would be tipped above the bowl. Tools would be rinsed only at the overflow's downstream edge. Clay would remain wrapped until used. The temporary slips were counted before and after work. These habits were so ordinary that speaking them felt almost ceremonial. Yet ordinary precautions kept a small task small. Tomas took a sip from Leela's tea and made a face at its strength. This could seal the stone by itself. "Then we can save the clay," Leela said. Amara accepted the cup after him. The tea had grown bitter, but rosemary cleared the mineral taste that clung to the cool air. She drank and looked at the silt ribbon breathing behind the stone. Each rise and fall was slight. Once identified, it seemed astonishing that she had not seen it at first. She reminded herself that knowledge altered attention. The ribbon had not been obvious before the twig mapped its effect. "If someone reads the record next season," C said, "they may come directly to this stone when a note softens." "Perhaps," Leela said. "What should stop them from assuming?" Amara considered. "The record should say what distinguished this event. Normal first depth, delayed center rise, inner surface curl, silt visible at the seat. Not only soft note meant silt." She added those signs in the margin. A useful history preserved patterns without turning them into rules too quickly. The float rose close to its trigger. Leela placed the holding latch ready, but did not engage it early. They allowed the bowl to reach the normal release point so they could see that the lever attempted its usual movement. Only then did she let the wooden block receive it. The gate stayed closed. The bowl's secondary overflow widened, carrying enough water to keep the upper reach wet. Nothing jarred. Nothing was forced backward. Amara marked the held cycle on the slate. Downstream, the previous release continued. They could hear it moving from the second rosemary bed to the first sage terrace, then to the lower junction. During those minutes, Thomas showed Amara how to distinguish washed clay from compressed clay by touch. Washed clay had a feathered edge and released a faint cloud. Compressed clay held the smooth impression of stone. At the loose corner, both signs appeared. Most of the old bed remained compressed, while the upstream edge had feathered away. "Remove all of it?" he asked. Amara studied the niche. "Only the softened strip and whatever prevents an even, thin bed. Sound old clay farther back belongs to the wall joint, not the listening slab seat." "Exactly. Cleaning does not mean making every surface new." The idea echoed the whole morning. Newness was not the standard. Clear function was. Leela returned from listening at the platform edge. "The release tail has reached the last sage turn." They waited. A breeze pressed loose hair across Amara's cheek. She tucked it back and watched shade recede along the survey cloth. The tools lay in ordered rows, but their selection had narrowed: little brush, baskets, clay knife, cord, 2 slips, 1 portion of clay. The mallet would be used only if sound alignment required it. Amara moved every unneeded tool to the cloth's upper half. The empty working space made the plan physically visible. At last, the lower junctions settled. Leela spoke the time. Amara wrote it. Tomas placed his bare palm against the center slab and waited until its small vibration faded with the water. "Now it carries only resting flow," he said. They removed the 2 marker stones exactly as planned. Amara checked each for cracks while it was in her hand. The second had a pale, natural vein but no split. The prior survey drawing showed the same line. The third was smooth. She placed their marked faces upward so there could be no confusion when resetting. With full water absent, tiny details emerged. A caddisfly case clung to the outer wall beyond the work area. Amara moved the basket inward to avoid it. A single rosemary needle lay against the first reference marker. Leela lifted it with wet fingers. "Our inspector has relatives," she said. This one found no pocket. The thinned flow exposed the gray-gold fan. Amara estimated its volume before disturbing it. Less than 1 full basket, likely less than half. Thomas agreed. Leela wrote the estimate so the record would not later inflate the obstructions simply because 3 people had worked on it. They inspected for upstream causes. The nearest floor joint was closed. No fresh silt trail entered from the wall. The pocket's finest grains matched the mineral sediment that naturally passed through the spring bowl over time. Shelter behind the thinned clay corner was enough explanation. "No source repair," Amara said. "No preventive wall coating," Thomas added. "No gate flushing," Leela said. Each rejected remedy had a plausible story attached to it. None was supported. Amara looped the cord around the stone using a flat hitch that would release under tension rather than bind tighter. Thomas tested it with 2 fingers. The cord's job was stability, not force. If the slab resisted the plan's seed width lift, they would stop and reconsider. Leela placed the first basket where the gentle current could drain through it. The second waited behind. She spread the settling cloth on the dry slab beyond the wall and weighted its corners with clean pebbles. "Start farthest from the seat," Thomas advised. "Otherwise, the first cloud will cover what you need to see." Amara had intended the same, but she welcomed the reminder. She knelt on the folded pad, checked that her sleeves were secured, and lowered the little brush into the cool water. For a breath, she simply felt the current move around her fingers. The practical work was about to begin, yet nothing in her body carried the tight haste she had felt on arrival. Observation had not delayed readiness. It had created it. "Ready," Leela said from the basket. Ready," Thomas answered at the cord. Amara touched the brush to the outer edge of the silt fan. The first pale grains rose together, showing exactly how softly they had rested there. Amara drew silt toward the willow basket in slow strokes. Water carried each pale cloud across the low rim while the weave held the mineral grains. Leela took every basket away half full, emptied it on the settling slab, and rinsed it in the overflow. Thomas held the listening stone steady. The spring sounded louder while the release gate remained closed, its bowl spilling a smooth, low note. Rosemary scent rose whenever Leela crossed the wall. Under the cliff, stone stayed cool despite the strengthening day. Amara worked from open floor toward the niche. She found no root, chip, or broken mortar. At the washed corner, she used the clay knife to remove only the softened remnant of the old bed. "How much remains?" Thomas asked. "1 strip, then the seat. My hand is comfortable." "Tell me before it isn't." "Well before it becomes heroic," Leela returned. "That would be a novelty worth recording." Amara tapped 2 wet stones and heard 2 different notes. The first gave the village channel's clear, rounded tone. The center listening stone answered dully, with a second sound beneath the first. These calibrated stones helped keepers hear changes in the measuring reach, but a changed note did not always mean a stone needed replacement. Now the silt pocket was clear. Thomas lifted the center slab only a seed's width and rested it on 2 slips. Amara inspected the underside. it was whole. The old clay seat had merely thinned at one corner, exactly as Thomas had suspected. She flattened fresh clay until it was no thicker than a rosemary leaf, making one even bed instead of filling the low corner twice. They removed the slips and settled the stone into its original niche. A narrow bead pressed out. Amara checked the inward lean, then tapped. The note rang clear but high. One gentle touch with the wooden mallet moved the top inward. She waited and tapped again. The clear note returned, single and round. It needed seating, Thomas said. Not replacing. The exposed clay bead was not symmetrical. Amara lifted the knife, imagining how neatly she could trim it. Perhaps lift and reset the stone so both edges matched. The hand-laid channel itself matched nothing exactly. Water threaded past the base with a clear sound. She set down the knife. One adjustment. One adjustment. Was it enough? Wheela asked. Amara checked the lean, pressed both corners, and listened once more. Yes. Then the clay may keep its own face. They removed the cord. Thomas flexed his hand. Amara brushed away the last stray grains and rinsed the center until the fitted floor showed pale and clean. At the next resting flow, she returned the 2 marker stones to their surveyed niches. The cuts aligned with the brass rule. They marked fixed heights, not preferred water levels. Neither required fresh mortar. Leela released the latch. Because the float had passed its trigger point, nothing happened at once. They waded through the bowl's next fill. Amara could have raised the gate by hand, but that would test a hand-raised gate rather than the actual cycle. The float eventually nudged its lever. Water entered the restored reach. It ran over the cleaned floor, divided around the stones, and rose beside the reset markers. At first the sound was untidy. Air escaped the newly wetted seam in little ticks. A faint gray trail lifted from the clay. The center note wavered. Amara's hand moved toward a sounding rod and stopped. The cleaned channel sounded uneven, but Amara did nothing. The upper measure had just received its first full release after the silt was removed, and the listening stone reseated. Its new clay bed was still wetting through. Tiny threads of air made the current chatter around the restored reach. Amara kept her hand away from the gates and sounding rods. 1 minute passed, then another. The water climbed to the reset markers without help. Bubbles slipped from the stone's base, the chatter softened, and the separate notes drew together. By the time the release reached its steady middle, the channel gave one clear, even sound. Waiting had been the final useful step. The first gauge reached its customary line. The second and third followed. Thomas watched the clay seam, no wash, no movement. Leela recorded the values. All lay within range. Amara let the rosemary twig travel again. It passed every listening stone without turning and entered the rosemary feeder, where Leela caught it. Inspector's final report? Domas asked. The reach is ready for its downstream test. The reach is ready for its downstream test. They did not mistake the clean note for completed work. The measure served the terraces, and a full release included its destination. They packed the unused clay and knife, but left gauges and slate ready. The cleaned reach shone through clear water. Its walls remained hand-laid, its clay bead uneven, its current alive with small variations. Stability had not made it rigid. It had made its changes intelligible. Before they followed the water, they allowed the full middle of the release to pass while standing at the measure. The first clear minute could have been fortunate. A sustained flow would show whether pressure against the newly seated stone changed its lean. Amara placed the brass rule across 2 fixed points on the wall, not touching the slab. The top of the listening stone remained aligned with the old survey scratch. Thomas watched the clay bead for any trembling grain. Leela watched the downstream marker. No change, Thomas said after several minutes. Third marker, steady, Leela said. Amara read the rule again. Top steady. Exchanged places so each observation had a second pair of eyes. Thomas read the alignment. Leela watched the seam, and Amara took the downstream depth. Their answers agreed without needing to be identical in wording. At the widest part of the reach, sunlight showed faint lines within the current. They converged upstream of the center stone, divided cleanly around its face, and joined downstream without the backward curl the twig had revealed. A single rosemary leaf that had fallen from the indicator passed lengthwise and did not hesitate. The silt basket held one last spoonful of cloudy water. Amara poured it through the settling cloth rather than into the channel. The captured grains joined the rest on the drying slab. Cleaning a measure while returning its obstruction to the water would have been efficient only in appearance. Damas examined the old clay fragments. They crumbled between his fingers rather than stretching. Age and a little wash, he said. No fault in the mix. Will the new bed last? Amara asked. It will last as clay does, long enough to be worth laying, not long enough to escape future attention. That answer satisfied her more than a promise of permanence. Maintenance assumed that sound things could still change. The listening stone had not betrayed its purpose by needing a renewed seat. Its changed note had fulfilled that purpose. Leela asked Amara to state the closure evidence before they went downstream. Amara counted on her fingers. Silt removed from floor and niche. Stone inspected whole. Seat renewed with one thin clay bed. Intended, lean restored. Second and third markers reset to fixed survey heights. Automatic gate initiated the test. Center note settled clear without adjustment. All 3 gauge readings are within their customary ranges. Seat remains stable through sustained middle flow. What remains? Confirm the release through rosemary, sage, and the lower junction. Observe the tail return. Asht. And after that? Record, clean, store, close. There was no secret item such as improve the visible bead or repeat. Until tired, Amara wiped the brass roll and returned it to the cloth. She picked up 1 gauge and the slate. As they left the platform, the spring bowl began the quiet decline that followed a full gate opening. Its surface moved below the crescent cut, then slowly started to rise again from the ceaseless inlet. The system did not pause to admire their repair. It continued. They followed the release down the saffron steps. Amara carried a gauge and the record slate. Leela carried the caught twig. Thomas remained near the spring for the first minutes, watching the new seat under full depth, then joined them once it held without change. At the upper rosemary bed, water entered the side notch and spread through dark soil. Amara checked the near root, center root, and outer margin. Moisture reached all 3 without pooling. She recorded the arrival time. The next terrace received its share a few breaths later. Its channel bent around an old rosemary trunk polished smooth where years of water touched it. No grain of fresh clay appeared in the flow. At the 3rd landing, they stopped to listen uphill. The restored upper measure sounded slightly uneven at this distance, but the difference came from wind passing through rosemary, not from the stone. When the breeze fell, the note held clean. Leela placed the twig in a small feeder. It traveled straight, caught harmlessly against a root guard, and was retrieved. Even surface pull. Ha! Amara gauged the feeder. Within by a finger's breadth. Ha! Customary range, Leela corrected gently. Within the customary range, Amara said. The wording mattered. A measurement was not a contest with a perfect center. Water varied with spring pressure, air, warmth, and the living draw of roots. The range represented useful stability, gathered through seasons, treating its midpoint as the only acceptable value would turn every sound variation into a fault. They crossed to the sage terraces. The broad leaves released their morning pearls when Thomas brushed past. A clean green scent joined the rosemary. Water moved more slowly through the wider western feeder, as it always had, yet reached each terrace within its expected interval. At the lower junction, the two threads rejoined without one pressing backward into the other. Amara lowered the gauge. The surface touched the center of the customary band. "One more reading after the tail passes," she said. They waited on the warm step. Thomas described the clay he would save and the silt he would mix after it dried. Leela laid the rosemary twig beside her. Amara watched no single point. She let her attention widen over terraces, insects, moving leaf shadows, and the changing pitches of the release. The full middle flow passed, then the tail arrived, a gradual lessening rather than a line. At first the feeders sounded irregular as small hollows drained. Amara felt the urge to climb back and check the center stone. Instead, she counted the expected intervals between the upper gate's closure and each terrace's return to rest. First rosemary softened. Second rosemary followed. Sage continued for a little longer because its feeder held more water at the bend. Then it too settled. At the lower junction, the final depth matched the customary resting mark. They began the return uphill, stopping at every marker. Amara read values. Leela compared them to the slate. Thomas inspected walls for new seepage. Every reading fell in range. No wall leaked. No plant bed remained dry. Halfway up, they paused where the steps turned east. The whole water path could be heard from there, not as separate machinery, but as a layered run, spring high above, measure under the cliff, 3 rosemary descents, 2 sage descents, and the lower junction. "It is not perfectly even," Amara said. "No," Leela agreed. "But it is stable." "Dace." "Yes." The distinction settled more deeply than an instruction. Perfect evenness would require stopping the living water to hold one chosen instant. Stability allowed it to vary and return. At the upper measure, Thomas reported that the clay line had not changed. Amara checked it once with her fingertip, then stepped back. They completed a second set of marker readings during the release tail. The first stood at its resting reference, the second a grain above its old low observation. The third centered. She tapped each listening stone once, allowing every note to fade before sounding the next. First, clear. Center, round, and single. Third, lower and free of the earlier tremble. Leela wrote the last acoustic observation. Would another release teach us anything necessary? Amara considered. A third cycle might reproduce the values. A fourth might do the same. Repetition could increase confidence, but beyond a point it merely postponed closure. We observed a full release from trigger through resting tail. We checked every downstream terrace. The seat held. All markers are reset, and all readings are customary. Another release is not necessary. Thomas covered the unused clay. Then I will take this home before it decides to become pottery. They washed the baskets in the overflow until the willow ran clear. Amara returned the sounding rods to their felt loops and dried the brass rule. Each gauge was rinsed, wiped, and checked for a swollen cap. None needed repair. Before washing the last gauge, Amara compared the downstream arrival times with 3 earlier records. The restored release reached the first rosemary notch within 2 breaths of the seasonal average, the first sage notch within 3, and the lower junction precisely at the common interval. She marked each comparison with a small open circle, the record sign for customary variation. Leela inspected the terrace soil behind them. No hidden dry edge? None. The upper rosemary margin darkened before the middle flow. Sage reached its outer basin before the tail. Thomas walked the opposite retaining wall. He ran a dry finger below each seam and held it up. Dust remained on his skin. A leak would have washed it away or darkened the stone. At the second rosemary bed, they found a shallow pool around one stem. Amara crouched at once, but the pool shrank while she watched. A fallen blossom had covered the soil's narrow drain hole, then lifted with the flow. She removed the blossom and checked the root guard. Remaining work? Ayafol asked. Amara watched the last film soak into the earth. No, a passing blossom already clear. They left the feeder unchanged. 5 steps farther on, a sage leaf leaned into the channel and divided the surface around its tip. It too was harmless. The presence of a visible irregularity did not make it part of their task. They made the return path at a deliberately slower pace. On the first descent, their attention had followed the front of the release. On the climb, they followed what remained: dampness, resting levels, and the absence of erosion. The 2 journeys answered different questions. At each landing, Amara placed the gauge at the fixed notch and waited 3 breaths before reading. Leela read the slate value only afterward, so expectation could not drag Amara's eye toward the old number. Sometimes the new value matched exactly. Sometimes it differed by a grain or finger's breadth. All belonged to the long-established band. The word customary-ac acquired weight through those small differences. It contained hot days and cool mornings, thirsty roots and wet soil, breezes that pressed a surface sideways, springs that breathed a little more strongly after distant rain. It was a record of useful return, not permission for carelessness. At the 4th landing, a shadow crossed the steps. A cloud no wider than the cliff drifted over the sun. The water's bright surface turned suddenly gray, making the depth harder to read. Amara waited. She did not lower her face closer and guess. When the cloud passed, the marker line became visible again. The value was ordinary. Another kind of no action, Leela said. Only until the observation was possible. Precisely. Near the lower junction, Thomas found a small crescent of old mineral crust. He wet it, rubbed it once, and showed that it did not dissolve. Not from today. Amara compared it with the wall's earlier sketch. The crust had been marked 2 seasons before. She left it. Removing it might make the wall look cleaner, but its stable edge served as a quiet historical reference for high water. They sat for the release tail. The sound diminished in stages. A feeder never emptied all at once. Water clung to rough stone, gathered into beads, and let go. The intervals between drops lengthened. Rosemary roots accepted the final threads. The lower junction became clear enough to reveal colored pebbles on its floor. Amara placed the gauge for the last time. The resting level aligned with its cut. Say it without numbers, Leela invited. The whole route accepted the release, remained within its usual levels, and returned to rest without help. And with numbers? Amara read the recorded series. Thomas listened for any value outside tolerance. There was none. They each signed the slate with a small initial mark: observer, confirming keeper, and stoneworker. Thomas's presence did not turn the record into a grand certification. It simply showed who had seen the seat before it disappeared beneath full water. On the climb, they met the onion-carrying child returning with empty hands. Did the silt listen? He asked. We moved it, Amara said. Is the spring fixed? The spring was never broken. The measure is clean and stable. He repeated the words as if trying their shape. Clean and stable. And still flowing, Leela added. The child ran ahead. His sandals slapped the warm steps, briefly covering the terrace notes. When he turned onto the village path, water became audible again, unchanged by whether anyone heard it. At the platform, Amara checked the clay seam one final scheduled time, after full passage, and returned to rest. The bead remained firm. She did not tap the center stone again. The acoustic confirmation already belonged to the record, and another tap would supply no missing fact. They removed the temporary chalk marks from the survey cloth, leaving no loose dust to enter the bowl. Leela counted the 6 marker pebbles in their box. Only the installed set belonged in the channel, and the spares all remained. Thomas coiled the cord. Amara checked the work area for a forgotten brush or slip of wood. Both temporary seating slips lay on the cloth. The little brush was in its loop. The clay knife was clean. No tool remained beneath the water. The practical task was complete. The silt was out. The listening stone sat soundly. The markers stood at their surveyed heights, and the water had proven the reach through a full release. There was no remaining work concealed beneath softer language. Still, Amara did not close the survey box immediately. She looked down the saffron steps, where the last water darkened narrow lines through the herbs. "I will make the final record after we store the tools," she said. Leela nodded. Completion could be recorded without being delayed. They carried the wash tools into the spring store while afternoon thinned toward evening. The small room was built into the cliff and smelled of dry willow, chalk, and old wood. Amara hung the gauges with space between their caps, placed the baskets upside down, and returned each sounding rod to its labeled loop. Thomas took the unused clay and left with the dried edge of the silk cloth folded under his arm. "The rest can dry overnight," he said. "I will mix it into the terrace mortar tomorrow. That is not upper measure work." Amara understood the kindness of the distinction. No remaining work meant no remaining work on the measure. The useful silt could enter another ordinary task without reopening this one. They wished Thomas a quiet evening. His steps descended until Rosemary hid him. At the survey shelf, Amara opened the record book. She copied the first observations, the bounded diagnosis, the cleaning method, the marker heights, the full release values, and the downstream confirmation. In the final field she wrote, "Stable through complete cycle. No further adjustment required." The entry occupied less than half a page. A morning could feel large from within and still reduce honestly to a few lines. Softened note, localized silt, soundstone, renewed seat, stable cycle. Amara did not decorate the record with every discarded possibility. Future keepers needed the evidence and action, not a performance of uncertainty. She added the weather and spring conditions in the margin. Beneath Thomas's name, she noted that 2 portions of clay had remained unused. That detail might help someone preparing for similar work, but it also preserved the scale of the repair. No replacement stone had been fitted. No gate component had been changed. Leela checked the figures against the slate. Once they agreed, Amara drew a single closing line under the entry. There would be no late observation written below it unless a genuinely new event occurred. She read the sentence twice. The second reading did not reveal a hidden qualification. Leela sanded the wet ink. Together they closed the book and slid it into its dry case. Amara shut the survey box, fastened both clasps, and placed it on the shelf. That should have been the end, and it was. The hour that followed did not serve as an extended test. It belonged to evening. Amara walked down the saffron steps with empty hands. At the upper landing she paused and listened to the measure. Its note came clear through the rosemary. She did not count its beats. At the second landing, pearled morning brightness had become amber shade. Bees had gone from the herb flowers. The stones, warmed all day, held a gentler heat at their centers, though their shaded edges were cool. She listened again, only after reaching the 4th landing. The interval was longer because no responsible observation required her to remain within sight of the spring. Water traveled through rosemary and sage with the casual assurance of something unattended and functioning. Leela caught up carrying the tea bottle and 2 cups. You are going the long way home. The steps are the same length. Your pauses have changed. Amara considered denying it, then smiled. I am listening at longer intervals. A demanding technique. Sat where the step widened beside an old rosemary bush. Leela poured the remaining tea. It was no longer hot, but sun-warmed stone had kept it pleasantly warm. The flavor was stronger after steeping all day, green and faintly bitter. Below, kitchen smoke rose between roofs. A bell marked the evening meal. One plain note. The village answered with doors, voices, and bowls set on tables. None of it disturbed the water's quieter continuity. When I first heard the soft note, Amara said, I had already planned to lift the 3 stones. I know. You knew? You looked at the pry bar before you looked at the gauge. Amara drank her tea. Lifting all 3 would have found the silt. Probably. It also might have loosened the other seats. Probably. It also might have loosened the other seats. Might have loosened the other seats. So waiting prevented unnecessary work. Leela rolled her cup between her palms. Waiting gave the channel time to tell you which work was necessary. That is not always the same thing. Sometimes waiting reveals urgent work. Sometimes it confirms none. The virtue is not delay by itself. Amara listened to the water at the next terrace. Responsible observation remains an action. Yes. It has a beginning, a purpose, and a point at which it is complete. And unnecessary adjustment often borrows the appearance of care. Leela smiled. That sentence belongs in a book, which means it may take years to become easy. They sat without speaking. Rosemary scented the air whenever the evening breeze crossed the bush. Somewhere among the terrace stones, a cricket began and stopped, then began again. Amara did not turn every silence into a test. Her attention rested where it wished, on the cup's rounded edge, on the fading warmth of the step, on Leela's steady presence. When the spring's note reached her, she received it. When other sounds covered it, she did not strain. After tea, Leela rinsed the cups at a lower feeder and tucked them into the cloth. Will you go back up? Will you go back up? The question was plain, not a challenge. Amara pictured the spring platform in dusk, the clean reach, the center stone's narrow clay bead, the marker cuts at the waterline. She could climb and make one extra check. It would take little time. She might hear precisely what she had heard before. She also pictured the completed record in its case, and the survey box with both clasps closed. No, she said. There is no late check scheduled, and nothing in the readings calls for one. I hedge Leela rose. Then we can leave by the lower path. I Hetchley continued down. Amara paused once near the final sage terrace, not to measure but because the sky above the cliff had turned the color of a plum skin. Cloudstep Spring was hidden from there. The upper measure's voice had merged with the other channel notes, impossible to isolate without effort. She let it remain merged. They did not hurry away from the lower terrace. Evening had cooled the air enough that the rosemary's scent no longer rose in warm waves. It gathered close to the shrubs, released only when a sleeve brushed the leaves. Leela pinched one tender tip, rubbed it between her fingers, and held out her hand. Amara breathed the clean, resinous fragrance. Tomorrow's tea, Leela said. From the bed we confirmed, from the bed that would have grown whether we praised it or not. They walked between the last sage rows. The soil held the day's release without gloss or puddle. Broadleaves had turned silver in the dusk, their soft hairs catching what little light remained. Amara touched one leaf with the back of a finger. It was dry above, cool beneath. At a stone bench halfway to the village path, Leela sat to retie her sandal. Amara stood nearby and realized she could no longer hear the individual listening stone. The entire upper channel was a faint, continuous thread. She felt no impulse to recover the missing distinction by climbing closer. The listening stone did not need to be audible from everywhere in order to hold. Its task was performed at the measure, within water, whether its note reached her or not. Leela finished the knot. "There was a time," she said, "when I checked the lower cistern 3 times every night after mortar work." Amara looked at her. Leela rarely offered stories whose lesson announced itself. Did it leak? Once. On the first check when the scheduled inspection found it. Never on the third. Did you keep going? Why did you keep going? Because returning felt like devotion. It took me a while to see that the feeling was mine, not the cistern's requirement. They resumed walking. Amara considered the many shapes care could take. Some were visible, baskets lifted, clay pressed, numbers written. Some were restraints, a gate left untouched, a sound allowed to settle, a closed survey box not reopened. "How did you stop?" she asked. "I wrote the inspection times before the work. Then I obeyed them unless the evidence changed. And if you worried between them?" I worried somewhere else." Amara laughed softly. The answer was not serene, which made it useful. At the lower path, lamps began to appear behind shutters. Their gold squares did not reach the cliff. The spring work belonged now to the blue remainder of daylight and soon would belong to darkness. Amara imagined water moving where she could not see it, filling the bowl, raising the cedar float, opening the gate, climbing the first marker, passing the listening stone, dividing toward herbs. Each stage had been confirmed. Imagination could repeat the sequence without becoming a summons. She and Leela stopped at a narrow footbridge over the lower feeder. The water there was only a hand wide. It slid under the bridge with a note too low to hear above crickets. "Would you change anything we did?" "SK?" Leela asked. Amara reviewed the day, not to reopen it, but to learn. I would still listen through the first cycle. I would still map before tapping. The twig was useful, but only because we treated it as a surface indicator. I would bring Thomas after the pocket was located, not before. I would use 1 clay bed and 1 sound adjustment. And the wait during the first full flow? Especially that. Why? Because the uneven sound came from the work settling, not from work left undone. Touching the gate would have changed the very condition we needed to observe. Teep that sentence too. Amara leaned over the bridge rail. The water reflected no sky now, only the dark underside of wood. A small bubble traveled beneath them and emerged downstream intact. The evening was not silent. Dishes knocked in houses. Someone practiced 3 notes on a reed pipe, paused and tried again. A dog barked once at a cart, yet the quieter final portion of the day came not from an absence of sound, but from the end of demand. None of those sounds required Amara to classify them. They reached the place where their paths divided. Leela offered the last rosemary sprig. Amara tucked it into the cord at her wrist. "For tea?" she asked. "Or for remembering that inspectors can be very small." Amara walked alone for a while, then chose a path that curved back within sight of the lowest saffron landing without ascending it. She was not returning to the measure. The distinction was clear in her feet. The path led home, and the terrace simply occupied the same landscape. At the landing, water continued to enter the lower cistern. A keeper from the evening kitchen lifted one jug, filled it, and walked away. She did not glance uphill. The ordinary use of water was the measure's real conclusion. Its stable level mattered so rosemary could grow, sage could drink, and a jug could fill without anyone thinking about the stone that helped regulate the root. Amara touched the cool jug rest after the keeper left. Its surface had been hollowed by years of vessels. Function left marks. Those marks did not imply neglect. She listened only when she reached the far side of the cistern. The upper channels were no longer distinct. She heard the low entry at her feet, and, perhaps, a high thread from the cliff. It was enough. At home she would wash the rosemary sprig, heat water, and perhaps write one sentence in her private notebook. She would not copy the survey values. They already lived where they belonged. She would not set an alarm for the late release. The plan for the night felt almost startling in its plainness. Eat, mend the loose button on her work apron, open the window to the cool air, sleep. She turned once toward the cliff. No lamp moved on the steps. No silhouette bent over the measure. Leela had gone home by her own path. Thomas's workshop showed a low amber light, likely where he had covered the clay. The spring itself remained unseen. Responsible observation had ended in a reliable conclusion. Unnecessary adjustment would have begun by pretending the conclusion was not reliable enough. Amara lowered her hand from the rosemary at her wrist and continued toward home. The first stars appeared above the spring cliff. Their light was too faint to pearl the stones as morning had. It rested instead on the broad darkness, offering no measurements. Amara went inside. She left the window open while she prepared a simple supper. Cool air entered with a trace of rosemary from the sprig she had set beside the kettle. From inside the room, the terrace water could not be heard at all. The silence did not become a question. After eating, she mended the apron button as planned. The needle passed in and out of the worn green cloth. She made 4 small stitches, tested the button once, and cut the thread. It was another task with a visible end. She brewed fresh rosemary tea and carried it to the window. The cup warmed both hands. Above the roofs, the spring cliff had become a single dark shape. No light marked the upper measure, and none was needed. Amara thought of the clear center note only once. She did not try to reproduce it perfectly in memory. She remembered instead the moment before it cleared. The chatter of air, her hand moving toward the rod, and then her choice to wait. The remembered pause felt spacious now. She opened her private notebook and wrote one line. Observation was complete when it had answered the useful question. Then she closed the notebook. She did not add the gauge values, the release intervals, or a plan for morning. Those belonged either in the survey record or nowhere. For a while she remained at the window with the closed book beneath one hand. The rosemary sprig lay on its saucer beside the kettle, its rinsed leaves darker than they had been on the terrace. When she brushed one leaf, its scent rose cleanly into the room. It carried no message from the channel. It was simply rosemary, gathered at dusk and waiting for another cup. Across the lane, a neighbor drew in a washing line. Wooden pins dropped one by one into a bowl. A shutter closed, then opened again while someone retrieved a forgotten cloth. The small correction made Amara smile. Not every second action was unnecessary. The question was whether the thing itself called for it. A shirt left outside in night damp did. A stone already seated, tested, and recorded did not. She set her empty supper bowl by the wash basin and poured a little water over it. The water circled once, carrying crumbs toward the center. She washed the bowl, dried it, and returned it to the shelf. There was no urge to wash it twice. Its clean surface offered a plain answer. Cool air moved through the room and lifted the edge of her curtain. Amara could smell stone after sunset, kitchen ash, and the last faint rosemary steam. Pearled light had begun the day by revealing every damp rim at Cloudstep Spring. Darkness now softened those edges, but it did not undo what daylight had shown. She considered whether she would listen from the upper landing in the morning. Perhaps she would hear the customary note while passing on another errand. Perhaps wind or village voices would cover it. Neither possibility belonged on a schedule. The completed record required no ceremonial return. Amara placed the notebook in its drawer and left the survey thought with it. Then she drew the blanket back, lay down, and listened to the ordinary settling of her own room. A roof beam easing after the day's warmth, the curtain touching the sill, the clay cup giving one faint tick as it cooled. The tea cooled. Night gathered around the open window. As sleep approached, the village channels continued beyond hearing. Amara trusted neither hope nor habit alone. She trusted the completed work, the observed cycle, and the clear boundary they had honored. She knew what the next release should do, though she could neither see nor hear it from her bed. The bowl would fill until its float lifted the lever. The upper measure would receive the water without a keeper beside it. If the completed cycle remained the reliable guide it had proved to be, the listening stone would hold its seat, the markers would keep their surveyed heights, and water would cross the restored reach to rosemary and sage in its customary time. No hand needed to return and improve it. No lamp needed to climb the saffron steps. Amara let that evidence be enough. In her mind, Cloudstep Spring remained as she had left it, flowing unattended, stable, and quietly complete.